The final decades of the 14th century witnessed a convergence of political and military pressures that would fundamentally reshape the political map of East Central Europe. In Poland, the death of King Louis I of Hungary in 1382 created a profound succession crisis. His youngest daughter, Jadwiga, was crowned king, but the Polish nobility faced an uncertain future. The absence of a strong male ruler threatened the territorial integrity of the kingdom, particularly its claims to Red Ruthenia and the ongoing conflict with the formidable Teutonic Knights. The Knights, a powerful monastic order of German origin, had established a formidable state along the Baltic coast and represented a constant threat to Polish and Lithuanian territories alike. Their expansionist policies and crusading ideology made them the primary geopolitical challenge of the era. Simultaneously, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, a vast and powerful pagan state, found itself in a precarious position. Under the rule of Grand Duke Jogaila, Lithuania was a major regional power, but it was also a target. For centuries, the Teutonic Knights had waged relentless crusades against the Lithuanians, justifying their territorial ambitions with a religious mission to Christianize the pagan population. These conflicts, a constant drain on Lithuanian resources, made the search for a new geopolitical strategy a matter of survival. The need for a powerful ally to counter the Knights became paramount. The solution emerged from a series of diplomatic negotiations that culminated in the Union of Crewe in 1385. This was not a formal constitutional act, but a personal and strategic agreement. It was proposed that Jogaila would marry the young Queen Jadwiga of Poland. In exchange for this marriage and the Polish crown, Jogaila and his Lithuanian people would convert to Catholicism. This conversion was a pivotal element, as it would instantly legitimize the Lithuanian state in the eyes of Christian Europe and, most importantly, remove the legal and religious pretext for the Teutonic Knights' crusades. The terms of the Union of Crewe were straightforward yet revolutionary. Jogaila, in becoming King of Poland, would unite the two crowns. The baptism of Lithuania was a mass conversion, conducted on a grand scale to secure the spiritual allegiance of the entire state. While the union was initially personal, binding the two states through their shared monarch, it laid the groundwork for a much deeper integration. It was a pragmatic alliance born of necessity, but its consequences were monumental, setting the stage for the formal creation of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the emergence of one of Europe's largest and most unique political entities. This genesis marked the beginning of a grand experiment in constitutionalism and noble democracy that would endure for centuries. How the Commonwealth modernized itself into a non-absolutist form of government where the king's power was subordinate to a parliament of nobles, a radical concept for its time, yet including a fatally flawed liberum veto right, which allowed a single deputy to paralyze all legislative action. What strategic and tactical methods they used to conquer and occupy Moscow, an event that no other nation in the history of the world was able to do before and after. What triggered the Union to form the first democratic constitution in Europe that became a blueprint for other European nations for the years that followed? The Union of Crewe in 1385, while a strategic diplomatic maneuver, hinged on a personal and political drama that would shape the future of Poland and Lithuania for centuries. At the heart of this was the young Queen Jadwiga of Poland, crowned at the age of 10, a figure of immense symbolic importance. As the heir to the Polish throne, her marriage was a matter of state, not personal choice. Jadwiga was already betrothed to Duke Wilhelm of Austria, a match that promised an alliance with the Habsburgs and was, by all accounts, a genuine affection on her part. However, this union did not serve the strategic interests of the Polish nobility, who sought a more powerful partner to consolidate the kingdom's position in the east and confront the Teutonic Knights. Jogaila, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, was a powerful, battle-hardened ruler from a pagan dynasty. His proposed marriage to Jadwiga was a political necessity. For him, it meant not only a crown, but a path to securing his vast, polytheistic realm from the relentless crusading pressure of the Teutonic Order. His conversion to Christianity was a fundamental condition of the union. It was an act of political and religious transformation on a scale rarely seen in European history. In the winter of 1386, Jogaila travelled to Krakow, where he was baptized into the Catholic faith under the name Władysław. This event marked the beginning of Lithuania's mass conversion, a process that would ultimately integrate the last major pagan state in Europe into the Christian world. The wedding of Władysław II, Jagiellon and Jadwiga of Poland took place on February 18, 1386. For Jadwiga, it was a profound personal sacrifice. She annulled her previous betrothal and entered into a political marriage with a man significantly her senior, a move that placed the needs of her kingdom above her own desires. For Jagiellon, it was a coronation, as he was immediately crowned King of Poland, uniting the two states under a single monarch and a single faith. This act effectively established the Jagiellonian dynasty, which would rule over Poland and Lithuania for over 2 centuries. The new dynasty was not simply a continuation of the Polish line. It was a new entity, a Polish-Lithuanian union rooted in a strategic alliance and a shared Catholic identity. The conversion of Lithuania was a complex, long-term process, but its official start with Jagiellon's baptism had an immediate and powerful effect. The Teutonic Knights' pretext for crusades was undermined, forcing them to seek new justifications for their territorial ambitions. The union transformed the political and religious landscape, establishing a powerful new force in East Central Europe that would challenge the old order and lay the foundation for a grand, multinational republic. Just a quick announcement, if you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. The Union of Kryło, while resolving the succession crisis in Poland and the existential threat to Lithuania, did not bring peace. Instead, it inaugurated a new and more complex phase in the long-standing conflict with the Teutonic Knights. The mass baptism of Lithuania was a profound blow to the order's religious and political legitimacy. For decades, the Knights had justified their state-building ambitions and constant warfare by appealing to a papal mandate to Christianize the last pagan realm in Europe. With that realm now officially converted to Catholicism, their primary ideological pretext for war was shattered. The order could no longer claim to be crusaders. However, the Knights were a deeply entrenched military and political power with vast resources and a well-defended state. They immediately shifted their strategy, challenging the sincerity of Lithuania's conversion and accusing King Władysław II Jagiellon of retaining pagan sympathies. They continued to launch military incursions, now framing them not as crusades, but as punitive expeditions against a heretical or false conversion. Their main territorial ambition centered on the region of Samogitia, a crucial area that separated the main Teutonic state in Prussia from the Order's branch in Livonia. The Knights sought to create a contiguous territorial empire along the Baltic coast, an objective that required the complete subjugation of Samogitia. The struggle over this region became the central point of contention in the decades following the Union. This period was marked by an intense diplomatic and propaganda war. The Polish-Lithuanian alliance, led by Jagiellon, repeatedly sent envoys to the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor, presenting the evidence of Lithuania's conversion and appealing for the international community to recognize the Union's legitimacy and condemn the Order's continued aggression. The Teutonic Knights, in turn, used their extensive network of connections across Europe to disseminate anti-Polish and anti-Lithuanian propaganda. They sought to portray Jagiellon as an opportunistic pagan and his union as a threat to Christian Europe, securing volunteers and financial support for their cause. The legal battles fought at papal courts became as important as the border skirmishes, defining the conflict as a struggle over sovereign rights and the true meaning of conversion. The precarious peace finally broke down in 1409. A Samogitian uprising against the Order's harsh rule provided the spark. Samogitian nobles, with the support of Jagiellon, openly rebelled against the Knights. The Grand Master of the Order, Ulrich von Jungingen, saw this as an act of war by the Polish-Lithuanian Union. Both sides began to mobilize for a large-scale confrontation, gathering massive armies. The ensuing military build-up and strategic maneuvering set the stage for one of the largest and most decisive battles of the Middle Ages, a final and violent arbitration of the fate of the Baltic frontier. The outbreak of the Great War in 1409 was a direct result of the long-simmering tensions between the Polish-Lithuanian Union and the Teutonic Knights. The Knights, under Grandmaster Ulrich von Jungingen, declared war after the Samogitian uprising, believing that a swift and decisive military campaign could break the Union. The Polish-Lithuanian side, led by King Władysław II Jagiełło and Grand Duke Vytautas, responded with a coordinated military build-up. Both sides understood that this was not a mere border skirmish, but a confrontation that would determine the geopolitical balance of the region for generations. The strategic centerpiece of the conflict was the massive Polish-Lithuanian army's march in the summer of 1410. In a highly coordinated maneuver, the Polish forces of King Jagiełło and the Lithuanian army of Vytautas met at the agreed-upon location of Czerwinsk on the Vistula River. There, engineers constructed a pontoon bridge that allowed the entire army to cross in a matter of days, a logistical feat that surprised the Knights' intelligence. This unified force, comprising Polish knights, Lithuanian banners, Ruthenian troops, and allied units from Bohemia, Moravia, and Tatar contingents, represented a formidable coalition. The Battle of Grunwald, also known as the Battle of Tannenberg or Żalgiris, took place on July 15, 1410. The combined Polish-Lithuanian forces numbered approximately 39-0, facing a Teutonic army of roughly 27-0. The Knights' army was composed of German and Western European volunteers, a highly professional and disciplined fighting force. The battle opened with the Lithuanian light cavalry, commanded by Vytautas, feigning a retreat. This tactical feint, a maneuver learned from their experience with nomadic warfare, drew the Knights' cavalry into a disorganized pursuit. While the Teutonic forces were preoccupied, the main Polish infantry and heavy cavalry engaged the Order's left flank. The battle was a grueling, multi-hour engagement fought across a vast field. The Polish heavy cavalry, supported by infantry, held the line against the Teutonic main charge. In the midst of the fighting, the Lithuanian forces, having regrouped, returned to the field to attack the Knights' rear. This flanking maneuver, combined with the steadfastness of the Polish centre, encircled and overwhelmed the Teutonic army. Grandmaster Ulrich von Jungingen was killed in the battle, a catastrophic loss of command. The Order suffered a devastating defeat, with a significant portion of its leadership and fighting force annihilated. The immediate aftermath, however, did not lead to the complete destruction of the Teutonic state. The Polish-Lithuanian forces did not press their advantage to besiege the capital of Malbork effectively. The resulting Treaty of Torun in 1411 was a diplomatic success, but not an existential defeat for the Order. The Knights ceded Samogitia, paid a substantial indemnity, and recognized the legitimacy of the Polish-Lithuanian Union. The moral and military authority of the Order, however, was irreparably broken. Grunwald solidified the Union, establishing it as a preeminent power in East-Central Europe and ensuring its survival for centuries to come. The aftermath of the Battle of Grunwald, though not leading to the immediate destruction of the Teutonic state, firmly established the Jagiellonian dynasty as a dominant power in East-Central Europe. The ensuing period, spanning the 15th and early 16th centuries, is widely regarded as the Golden Age of Poland and Lithuania. This era was characterized by remarkable political stability, territorial expansion, and a flourishing of cultural and economic life. The dynasty's influence reached its zenith, with members of the Jagiellonian house ruling not only the Polish-Lithuanian Union but also the kingdoms of Bohemia and Hungary, creating a vast network of personal unions across the continent. A key figure in this period was Casimir IV Jagiellon, who ruled from 1447 to 1492. His long reign was marked by the successful 13 Years' War, against the Teutonic Knights, which concluded with the Second Peace of Turin in 1466. This treaty resulted in the incorporation of Royal Prussia into the Polish crown and reduced the Order's state to a vassal of Poland. The acquisition of this Baltic coastline and major cities like Gdańsk and Torun secured Poland's control over vital maritime trade routes, particularly for grain exports, which became the economic backbone of the Commonwealth. This political success solidified the Jagiellonian authority and neutralized the primary external threat for generations. Under the Jagiellons, the Polish-Lithuanian state transitioned from a personal union into a more cohesive political entity. The nobility, or Szlachta, saw its power consolidated and codified. The Nihil Novi Constitution of 1505 was a landmark legal act that prohibited the king from enacting any new laws without the consent of the Sejm, the noble parliament. This legislation effectively cemented the unique political system of a noble republic, where the monarch's power was significantly limited and the legislative authority rested with the land-owning elite. The Jagiellonian Golden Age was also a time of profound cultural transformation. The Renaissance, which had swept across Italy, began to take root in Poland, particularly at the royal court in Krakow. Sigismund the Old, who reigned from 1506 to 1548, and his Italian wife, Bona Sforza, were prominent patrons of the arts and sciences. They initiated significant architectural projects, including the reconstruction of Wawel Royal Castle in the Renaissance style. This period saw the flourishing of science, with scholars like Nicolaus Copernicus attending the Jagiellonian University. The economic prosperity fueled by the grain trade, combined with political stability and enlightened patronage, created a fertile ground for a cultural and intellectual flowering that left a lasting legacy. The political landscape of Poland and Lithuania underwent a significant transformation during the Jagiellonian period, marked by the steady evolution of noble power and the formalization of parliamentary institutions. This process was a direct consequence of the monarchy's reliance on the landowning nobility, or Szlachta, for military service and financial support. In exchange for these contributions, the monarchs were compelled to grant the nobility an increasing number of privileges and legal guarantees, which gradually shifted the balance of power away from the crown. This development laid the foundation for the unique political system known as the Noble Republic. The origins of the Polish parliament, the Sejm, can be traced back to regional assemblies, Sejmiki, and the monarch's general assemblies, which brought together nobles and magnates. These gatherings, initially convened to advise the king on matters of war, peace, and taxation, evolved over time into a formal legislative body. The process of this evolution was gradual, but key legal acts accelerated the institutionalization of noble power. The privilege of Cossais in 1374, granted by King Louis I, was a watershed moment, making noble consent a prerequisite for new taxes. This privilege was a powerful precedent that future monarchs were forced to respect. The definitive institutionalization of the Sejm as a bicameral parliament occurred in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. It comprised two chambers, the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies. The Senate consisted of high-ranking officials, bishops, voivodes, and castellans who served as the king's council. The Chamber of Deputies, however, was the true innovation. Its members, elected by the local noble assemblies, Sejmiki, represented the interests of the broader Szlachta. This structure ensured that the king's power was checked not only by the magnates, but also by the gentry, creating a system of governance that was highly unusual in contemporary Europe. This process culminated in the Nihil Novi Constitution of 1505, a landmark legal act that cemented the Sejm's legislative authority. The Latin phrase, meaning nothing new, stipulated that the king could not enact any new laws or alter existing ones without the explicit consent of the two chambers of the Sejm. This effectively made the Sejm the primary legislative power in the kingdom, reducing the monarch to an executive figure who ruled with the consent of the governed. The Nihil Novi Statute was not merely a restriction on royal authority, it was a formal declaration of the Polish-Lithuanian state as a noble republic. The reign of Sigismund I, known as Sigismund the Old, from 1506 to 1548, represents a period of quiet consolidation and enduring prosperity for the Polish-Lithuanian state. This era, situated squarely in the Golden Age, was characterized less by major military conflicts and more by astute diplomacy and internal stability. Sigismund was a figure of the High Renaissance, a monarch whose rule emphasized statecraft, cultural patronage, and the careful management of a powerful noble republic. His reign witnessed the full maturation of the political system defined by the Nihil Novi constitution, where the king's power was constrained by the same, and governance was a continuous negotiation between the crown and the Szlachta. One of Sigismund's most significant achievements was the resolution of the centuries-old conflict with the Teutonic Knights. In 1525, he brokered the Treaty of Krakow, a landmark agreement with Grand Master Albert of Prussia. In this treaty, Albert formally secularized the Teutonic Order's state in Prussia, converting it into a hereditary duchy. The Grand Master swore an oath of fealty to the Polish king, becoming the first Duke of Prussia and a vassal of the Polish crown. This event, known as the Prussian Homage, permanently settled the Baltic frontier, removing the order as a geopolitical threat and securing Poland's control over its vital grain trade routes. This diplomatic victory was achieved without a major war and was a testament to Sigismund's political skill. While the Commonwealth enjoyed relative external peace, the winds of the Protestant Reformation were beginning to sweep across Europe. The Lutheran movement, originating in Germany, found fertile ground in Royal Prussia and among the German-speaking burghers of Polish cities. The Jagiellonian state, however, did not experience the widespread religious wars that devastated Western Europe. Sigismund the Old, a devout Catholic, initially took a cautious approach. He banned the publication of Lutheran texts but did not enforce a systematic persecution of Protestants. This policy of relative tolerance was a pragmatic response to the political realities of the noble republic, where the king lacked the absolute power to impose a single faith on a diverse population. This religious forbearance, born of necessity and a certain degree of royal indifference, had profound long-term consequences. It allowed Protestantism to take root, particularly among the nobility, and laid the foundation for the unique religious pluralism that would later become a hallmark of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Sigismund's reign, therefore, was not merely a time of prosperity and political stability, but a crucible where the enduring issues of religious difference and noble power were first tested, setting the stage for the challenges and opportunities of the century to come. The religious landscape of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the mid-16th century was uniquely defined by its avoidance of the large-scale religious conflicts that were devastating Western Europe. While neighbouring states were embroiled in civil wars and imperial-level strife, the Commonwealth managed a complex process of religious change through a policy of de facto and later de jure toleration. This unique outcome was not the result of a single ideological commitment, but rather a pragmatic combination of political realities, the decentralized nature of noble power, and a cultural tradition of pluralism. The seeds of the Reformation had been sown during the reign of Sigismund the Old, and under his son, Sigismund II, Augustus, 1548-1572, they blossomed. The Lutheran movement was the first to gain a significant foothold, primarily among the German-speaking burghers of cities in Royal Prussia and Livonia. The adoption of Lutheranism by the Dukes of Prussia also gave the movement an institutional anchor on the Commonwealth's periphery. However, it was Calvinism that proved most influential among the Polish and Lithuanian nobility, or Szlachta. The appeal of Calvinism's congregational governance and its focus on individual conscience resonated with the nobility's political ideals of liberty and self-rule. This widespread adoption of Protestantism by a large segment of the ruling class made top-down persecution nearly impossible. The king, constrained by the Nihil Novi constitution, could not impose a single religious doctrine without the consent of the same, and with a growing number of deputies and senators embracing different Protestant denominations, Any attempt at forced conversion or persecution would have resulted in political gridlock and rebellion. The decentralized power of the Szlachta meant that nobles could protect Protestant congregations and churches on their own lands, effectively making their estates havens of religious freedom. The political imperative for unity in the face of external threats, particularly from Muscovy and the Ottoman Empire, also encouraged a policy of toleration. The nobility understood that internal religious division would fatally weaken the Commonwealth. This led to a series of legal acts that codified religious freedom. The Warsaw Confederation of 1573, a landmark constitutional act signed by the Sejm, guaranteed peace between all denominations and extended protection to all Christians in the Commonwealth. This was a revolutionary legal guarantee in an age defined by the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion. The Warsaw Confederation enshrined the Commonwealth's unique status as a state without stakes, where religious difference was managed through legal guarantees rather than violence. The reign of Sigismund II Augustus, from 1548 to 1572, represented the culmination of the Jagiellonian dynasty's rule and, ultimately, its end. While his father's reign was marked by relative calm, Sigismund II Augustus faced a series of profound challenges that tested the foundations of the Polish-Lithuanian state. Central among these was the existential question of succession. As the last male member of his dynasty, and with his marriages failing to produce a male heir, the prospect of an interregnum loomed large. This created a political vacuum and a national crisis, as the union of Poland and Lithuania had been held together for nearly 2 centuries by the personal ties of the Jagiellonian monarchs. Without a dynastic heir, the future of the union was uncertain, and the two states faced the possibility of separation. This internal crisis was compounded by a severe external threat, the Livonian War. From 1558, Muscovy under Ivan the Terrible began a campaign to conquer the Livonian lands on the Baltic coast, a region strategically vital to both Poland and Lithuania. The war exposed the military and financial weaknesses of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which bore the brunt of the Muscovite aggression. The Lithuanian nobility, already grappling with internal reform, recognized that they could not defend their vast eastern frontiers alone. They needed a more permanent and institutionalized alliance with the stronger and wealthier Kingdom of Poland. The solution to both the dynastic crisis and the geopolitical threat was the Union of Lublin in 1569. This was not a passive act, but a highly contentious political struggle orchestrated by King Sigismund II Augustus and supported by a majority of the Polish and some Lithuanian nobility. The act transformed the personal union of the two states into a real, single political entity, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Its terms were revolutionary. The union created a single monarch who would henceforth be elected and a single Sejm parliament with a unified foreign policy and currency. This effectively merged the two crowns into one. However, the union was also a compromise. Lithuania retained its own separate laws, treasury, and army, preserving a distinct sense of national identity. The Union of Lublin successfully solved the immediate succession problem by creating a unified political body to elect a new monarch. The death of Sigismund II, Augustus 3 years later, in 1572, marked the end of a dynasty, but the beginning of a unique grand experiment in elective monarchy and noble self-governance. The Crown's final struggle had not led to the dissolution of the state, but to its transformation into one of the most distinctive political entities in early modern Europe. The Union of Lublin, ratified in 1569, stands as a watershed moment in the history of East Central Europe, transforming a personal union of two states into a single, cohesive political entity. This act was not a simple agreement, but a highly complex and contentious political process, driven by the geopolitical pressures of the Livonian War and the looming succession crisis in the Polish-Lithuanian realm. King Sigismund II, Augustus, the last of the Jagiellonian dynasty, was the key orchestrator, using his authority to navigate the competing interests of the Polish and Lithuanian nobilities. The Polish szlachta favoured a closer union to gain access to the vast eastern territories and military resources of Lithuania, while the Lithuanian magnates, wary of Polish domination, initially resisted a full merger. The negotiations were protracted and marked by Lithuanian walkouts from the Sejm, which met in Lublin. In response to this resistance, Sigismund II Augustus took a decisive and controversial step. He unilaterally incorporated the Ukrainian voivodeships of Podlakia, Volhynia, Kiev, and Brakwa, which were under Lithuanian control, into the Polish crown. This act, known as the Union of Lublin, was a dramatic power play. It gave the Polish nobility a powerful incentive to support the union, as they gained immense new territories, and forced the Lithuanian magnates to return to the negotiating table, as their economic and political power base had been significantly diminished. The final act of the union was a carefully constructed compromise. It established a single, bicameral parliament, the Sejm, where Polish and Lithuanian deputies would deliberate and vote together on matters of foreign policy, taxation, and military affairs. The monarch, henceforth elected by the combined nobility of both nations, would be the sovereign of the newly formed Commonwealth. The union also introduced a unified currency and removed customs barriers between the two states, facilitating economic integration. Crucially, the union was not an act of total assimilation. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania retained its own separate government, its own legal code, the Lithuanian statutes, its own army, and its own treasury. It was a federation of two equal entities, bound by a shared political system and a common monarch. The formal name of this new state, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Rzeczpospolita Obojga Narodów, literally Republic of Two Nations, reflected this unique federal structure. The Union of Lublin successfully solved the dynastic and geopolitical crises of the era, creating an unprecedented multinational republic that would be a major European power for centuries to come. The death of Sigismund II Augustus in 1572 plunged the newly formed Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth into its first interregnum, an unprecedented political crisis with no Jagiellonian heir. This period marked the true dawn of the elective monarchy, a system that would define the Commonwealth's political life for the next 2 centuries. The nobility, or szlachta, seized this opportunity to codify their power and ensure that the future monarch would be subject to their will. The result was a series of constitutional acts that fundamentally restructured the relationship between the king and the state, most notably through the creation of Henry's Articles. The first free election was a complex and contentious affair. Candidates from across Europe vied for the crown, including figures from the Habsburg, Swedish, and French royal houses. The Polish-Lithuanian nobility, meeting in a vast field outside Warsaw, carefully weighed the merits and promises of each contender. Ultimately, the Sejm chose Henry of Valois, the brother of the French king Charles IX. The choice was a strategic one, intended to secure a powerful ally against Muscovy and the Ottoman Empire, and to bring the Commonwealth into the orbit of Western European diplomacy. However, the nobility's support for Henry was contingent on his acceptance of a non-negotiable set of legal and political conditions. These were the so-called Pacta Conventa and the key constitutional document known as Henry's Articles. Henry's Articles, ratified in 1573, were a revolutionary legal document that enshrined the principles of the noble republic and severely limited the monarch's power. They stipulated that the king was not the sovereign ruler but an elected executive, ruling with the consent of the nobility. The articles included a number of provisions that became cornerstones of the Commonwealth's political system. The king was required to summon the Sejm every 2 years. He was forbidden from making any laws without its consent. The articles also established a council of senators who would serve as the king's advisors, further restricting his unilateral authority. Most importantly, Henry's Articles included a right of confederation and rebellion recoche for the nobility if the king were to violate the terms of his election. This was a radical provision, giving legal justification for resistance to a monarch who overstepped his constitutional bounds. Henry's election and the articles he was forced to accept marked a pivotal moment in European history. institutionalizing a form of constitutional monarchy where the power of the elected king was subordinate to the will of the nobility. The death of Sigismund II, Augustus in 1572 left the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth without a monarch for the first time in its history. This event triggered the first free election, a political process that would become a defining feature of the noble republic for the next 2 centuries. The election was a grand and chaotic affair, drawing candidates and political intrigue from across Europe. The 3 main contenders for the crown were Archduke Ernest of Austria, a representative of the powerful Habsburg dynasty, Ivan the Terrible of Muscovy, a formidable but deeply feared neighbour, and Henry of Valois, the younger brother of the French king Charles IX. The election took place at a vast field in Wola, near Warsaw, where the entire body of the nobility, the Szlachta, was technically eligible to participate. While the full mass of the gentry did not attend, thousands of nobles from both Poland and Lithuania gathered to cast their votes, a sight unparalleled in contemporary Europe. This assembly, known as the Electoral Sejm, was where candidates presented their offers, and the nobles hammered out the terms of the future king's rule. The primary consideration was not a candidate's lineage, but their willingness to accept the constitutional limitations placed upon them, particularly the newly created Henry's Articles. Ultimately, the choice fell to Henry of Valois. His candidacy was supported by a faction of the nobility who believed an alliance with France could counter the influence of the Habsburgs and secure the Commonwealth's diplomatic position in Western Europe. As part of his agreement, he was required to sign the Pacta Conventa, a list of specific commitments tailored to him, and formally accept Henry's Articles. His coronation took place in Krakow in February 1574. Henry's reign, however, was exceptionally brief and turbulent. He struggled to adapt to the constraints of the noble republic, where his power was subordinate to the Sejm and the Szlachta. He was accustomed to the absolutist traditions of the French court and found the constant political negotiation and noble oversight intolerable. Just over a year into his rule, in June 1574, news arrived in Poland that his brother, King Charles IX, had died. This event presented Henry with an opportunity to escape the confines of his elected throne and claim the crown of France. In an act that became a symbol of the elected monarch's tenuous loyalty, Henry secretly fled Poland under the cover of night, abandoning the Commonwealth and its political system. He left behind a throne that was once again vacant, forcing the nobility to prepare for a second, and equally contentious, election. The sudden and scandalous flight of Henry of Valois in 1574 plunged the Commonwealth into a second interregnum. The nobility, incensed by the monarch's disloyalty, was forced to resume the political process of electing a new king. The second election was as contentious as the first, with strong factions supporting the Habsburg Emperor Maximilian II. However, a powerful counter-faction emerged, advocating for a native or a non-Habsburg candidate who would be more compliant with noble liberties. Their choice fell on Stephen Bathory, the Prince of Transylvania. Bathory's selection was a pragmatic act. He was a skilled military leader and a diplomat from a regional power, and he was willing to accept the full constitutional limitations of the Commonwealth's monarchy. Bathory was crowned King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania in 1576. His reign, though lasting only a decade, was a period of significant military and institutional reform. As a seasoned warlord, Bathory immediately recognized the need for a standing, professional army to defend the Commonwealth's vast borders against Muscovy and the Ottoman Empire. The traditional noble levy, or Pospolite Russany, was an unreliable and inefficient force, effective only for short campaigns and lacking the discipline required for modern warfare. To address this, Bathory introduced a series of key military reforms. The most important of these was the creation of a professional infantry force known as the Piechota Wybranecka. This was a peasant army, raised from royal lands, where one peasant from every 20 royal land plots was conscripted for military service. These soldiers were well trained, equipped with firearms, and paid directly by the state, providing the Commonwealth with its first truly modern and reliable infantry. Bathory also heavily invested in artillery and siege warfare, recognizing its crucial role in campaigns against fortified Muscovite cities. Furthermore, Bathory's military leadership was defined by his personal command and strategic acumen. He revitalized the Commonwealth's army by demanding discipline and competence from the Slakta banners. He personally led 3 major campaigns against Muscovy, culminating in the siege of Pskov. These campaigns demonstrated the effectiveness of his reformed army and forced Muscovy to the negotiating table. The reign of Stephen Bathory, therefore, marked a pivotal period where the Commonwealth's military capabilities were restored and its political institutions were strengthened by a king who understood the necessity of both noble liberty and effective statecraft. Bathory's campaigns against Muscovy were a masterclass in strategic planning and military execution. He conducted 3 major expeditions into Muscovite territory between 1579 and 1581. His strategy was to avoid a frontal assault on Muscovy's main forces and instead to target key fortified cities and fortresses in the Livonian region and the northern borderlands. His primary objective was not the conquest of Muscovy, but the recovery of lost territories and the enforcement of a favorable peace treaty. The first campaign, in 1579, focused on the recapture of Polotsk, a strategic fortress on the Dvina River that controlled access to Livonia. Bathory's reformed army, which included a new professional infantry, the Piechota Wybranika, and a powerful contingent of artillery, successfully laid siege to and captured the city. This victory was a major blow to Muscovy and a significant morale boost for the Commonwealth. The second campaign, in 1580, was even more ambitious. Bathory marched his army deep into Muscovite territory to besiege Velikia Luki, another vital fortress. The city fell after a hard-fought siege, demonstrating the effectiveness of Bathory's investment in artillery and siege warfare. The culmination of Bathory's military efforts was the third campaign in 1581, which saw his forces lay siege to Pskov, one of Muscovy's largest and most heavily fortified cities. The siege was a brutal and protracted affair, but Bathory's forces held a significant advantage in artillery and siege techniques. While the city did not fall, the siege proved to be a decisive diplomatic tool. Ivan the Terrible, facing a formidable and relentless opponent on his doorstep, agreed to negotiate. The ensuing Treaty of Jam-Zapolsky in 1582 was a major diplomatic victory for the Commonwealth. Muscovy was forced to return all of Livonia to Poland and renounce all its claims to the region. Bathory's campaigns had effectively reversed the course of the Livonian War, reasserting the Commonwealth's power in the east and establishing his legacy as a brilliant military strategist. The death of Stephen Bathory in 1586 once again left the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth without a monarch, initiating the third free election. The primary candidates were Archduke Maximilian of Austria and Sigismund Vasa, the son of the Swedish king, John III. Sigismund's candidacy was a complex proposition. As the son of a Catholic mother and a Protestant father, and a devout Catholic himself, he was seen as a potential bridge between the various religious factions within the Commonwealth. His election was also a strategic calculation. A union with Sweden through a shared monarch promised to secure the Baltic Sea, a vital economic and geopolitical objective for the Commonwealth. Sigismund was elected king in 1587, and, as a part of his Pacta Conventa, agreed to annex Swedish Estonia to the Commonwealth and to rule both kingdoms in a personal union. Sigismund III. Vasa's reign, however, was defined by the inherent conflict between his personal ambition and the constitutional realities of the Commonwealth. His main goal was to inherit the Swedish throne and restore Catholicism to Sweden, a Protestant kingdom. This ambition created a deep and lasting entanglement between the two nations. Upon his father's death in 1592, Sigismund was crowned King of Sweden, but his rule there was short-lived. His uncle, Duke Charles, who was a staunch Protestant and a powerful magnate, led a rebellion against him. The conflict culminated in the Battle of Stongebro in 1598, a decisive victory for Duke Charles. Sigismund was formally deposed from the Swedish throne in 1599. Sigismund's deposition in Sweden did not, however, end his ambition to reclaim the throne. This became the central driving force behind Polish foreign policy for the first half of the 17th century. The Polish Sejm, which had initially been wary of a war with Sweden, was dragged into the conflict by Sigismund's declaration of the incorporation of Estonia into the Commonwealth. This act, in 1600, was a direct challenge to Swedish authority and initiated a long and destructive war over the control of Livonia. The war with Sweden, lasting until 1629, was a costly affair for the Commonwealth. While it produced a number of significant military victories, it drained the Commonwealth's treasury and distracted it from other pressing geopolitical concerns in the east and south. Sigismund's unwavering pursuit of the Swedish crown, motivated by dynastic and religious zeal, put the Commonwealth in a state of perpetual conflict. His reign, therefore, marked a departure from the internal stability of the Jagiellonian era, inaugurating a period of sustained external warfare driven by the ambitions of an elected monarch rather than the strategic interests of the noble republic itself. The long and destructive war with Sweden, initiated by Sigismund III, Vasa's dynastic ambitions, was a period of mixed results for the Commonwealth. While it drained the treasury and distracted from other geopolitical concerns, it also showcased the military prowess of the Commonwealth's army, particularly the Polish and Lithuanian heavy cavalry, the Hussars. This era, defined by conflict, also marked the zenith of the Hussars' effectiveness on the European battlefield. Their unique combination of armour, weaponry, and shock tactics made them a fearsome and often decisive force in the wars of the early 17th century. The Battle of Kirchholm in 1605 stands as the most dramatic testament to the military superiority of the Hussars during this period. The Commonwealth's army, under the command of Grand Hetman of Lithuania, Jan Karol Chodkiewicz, was heavily outnumbered by a well-equipped Swedish force led by King Charles IX. Chodkiewicz's army consisted of approximately 800 men, while the Swedish army numbered around 11. The Swedish forces were comprised of disciplined infantry formations, including musketeers and pikemen, and a significant contingent of cavalry, a formation that was standard for contemporary Western European armies. Chodkiewicz's strategy at Kirchholm was a classic example of tactical genius. He used a feigned retreat to lure the Swedish forces off a defensible position on high ground and into a valley. As the Swedes advanced, their formations became stretched and disorganized. At the critical moment, Chodkiewicz launched a massive charge of over 10 Hussars. The charge was a devastatingly effective maneuver, combining the psychological impact of their appearance with the physical force of their lances. The Hussars' lances, which could be up to 6.2 meters long, were a primary shock weapon designed to break enemy infantry formations and dismount opposing cavalry. The charge shattered the Swedish infantry and cavalry lines, with the disciplined Swedish pikemen unable to withstand the kinetic energy of the heavy cavalry. The battle lasted for less than 2 hours. The Swedish army was routed, suffering over 60 casualties, including a significant portion of its command structure. The Commonwealth's army, by contrast, suffered minimal losses. Kirchholm was a stunning military victory, demonstrating that a smaller but better trained and tactically superior army could defeat a larger, technologically modern force. However, despite the brilliance of the victory, Kirchholm did not lead to a strategic triumph for the Commonwealth. Sigismund III's political ambitions and the Sejm's reluctance to fund a prolonged war meant that the Commonwealth could not capitalize on its military success. The war continued, but Kirchholm's echo would resonate for centuries as a symbol of the Commonwealth's military might at its peak. The beginning of the 17th century presented the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth with a unique opportunity to assert its dominance in the East, not through direct conquest, but through intervention in Muscovy's internal affairs. The death of Ivan the Terrible in 1584, followed by the death of his son and heir, Fyodor I, in 1598, plunged Muscovy into a period of profound political, social, and economic turmoil known as the Time of Troubles. This power vacuum, exacerbated by famine and popular unrest, led to a civil war with multiple contenders for the Muscovite throne, all claiming to be Dmitry Ivanovich, the allegedly murdered youngest son of Ivan the Terrible. The Commonwealth, under the reign of Sigismund III Vasa, became deeply entangled in these events. The first false Dmitry, as he was known, appeared in Poland and gained the support of a number of Polish magnates and Cossack leaders. Sigismund III, though officially cautious, saw an opportunity to extend Polish influence and restore Catholicism in Muscovy. The false Dmitry, promising to cede territory to the Commonwealth and secure a dynastic alliance, was provided with financial and military support, albeit unofficially, to launch an invasion. This intervention, in 1604, was initially successful, and the false Dmitry seized the Muscovite throne. His reign, however, was brief, and he was assassinated in 1606. The chaos continued with the emergence of a second false Dmitry, who also gained Polish-Lithuanian support. The Commonwealth's involvement became more direct and official in 1609 when King Sigismund III, driven by his dynastic ambitions to place a Vasa on the Muscovite throne, declared war. The Commonwealth army, commanded by Grand Hetman Stanisław Żółkiewski, a brilliant military strategist, crossed the border and initiated a campaign that would lead to some of the most remarkable victories in Polish military history. The key confrontation came at the Battle of Klusino in 1610, where a small but highly effective Polish force, heavily reliant on the charge of the hussars, routed a much larger Muscovite and Swedish army. Following this victory, Żółkiewski marched to Moscow and, in a truly unprecedented event, captured the city and occupied the Kremlin. The Muscovite boyars, a council of nobles, offered the throne to Sigismund's son, Władysław. For a brief period, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had its forces in the heart of Muscovy. This was the high watermark of Polish power in the east. However, the plan ultimately failed. Sigismund III's insistence on taking the throne himself, coupled with his desire to impose Catholicism, alienated the Muscovite nobility. The Polish-Lithuanian army was eventually expelled from Moscow in 1612, and the Romanov dynasty was established, marking a missed opportunity for a lasting political union in the East. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's geopolitical reality was defined not only by its rivalry with Muscovy and Sweden, but also by a persistent and often costly conflict with the Ottoman Empire and its vassal states. This conflict, centered on the southern and southeastern frontiers, was a constant feature of the Commonwealth's history from the 16th to the 18th centuries. The borderlands, known as the Ukrainian steppes, were a zone of continuous raiding and military pressure, primarily from the Ottoman-aligned Crimean Khanate. The Commonwealth's vast, unfortified borders and its reliance on a feudal levy for defence made it particularly vulnerable to these incursions. The raids from the Crimean Tatars were a major source of instability and human suffering. These highly mobile, light cavalry forces would sweep into the southern territories, burn villages, and capture civilians to be sold into slavery in Ottoman markets. The scale of these raids was immense, with tens of thousands of people captured over the centuries. The Commonwealth, lacking a large standing army, struggled to mount an effective defence. The primary response was through the deployment of Cossack forces and the construction of fortress networks, but these measures were often insufficient to stop the swift Tatar incursions. This endemic conflict led to a series of full-scale wars with the Ottoman Empire, which was at the zenith of its power in the 17th century. The first major war, the Polish-Ottoman War of 1621, was a direct result of Commonwealth support for a Moldavian uprising against Ottoman rule. The conflict was defined by the Battle of Kotin, where a small Polish-Lithuanian force, supplemented by a large Cossack army, successfully held off a massive Ottoman invasion. The battle was a strategic victory for the Commonwealth, forcing the Ottomans to the negotiating table and leading to a peace treaty that reaffirmed the Commonwealth's authority over Moldavia. However, this peace was fragile and expensive, requiring the Commonwealth to pay for its defence with constant tribute to the Ottoman Empire and its Crimean vassals. The Khotin victory did not secure a lasting peace. The southern frontier remained a constant source of tension, drawing the Commonwealth into a new series of wars with the Ottoman Empire and the Crimean Khanate throughout the 17th century. These conflicts, though often successful from a military standpoint, were a major drain on the Commonwealth's resources. The necessity of a large army, combined with the Sejm's reluctance to raise taxes, led to a cycle of fiscal instability and military unpreparedness. The cost of defending the southern frontier, both in blood and treasure, would be one of the major factors contributing to the Commonwealth's eventual decline. The unique political system of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, often referred to as the Noble Republic, was built on the principle of noble liberty. This system, which had its roots in the Nihil Novi constitution and was codified in Henry's Articles, was a source of national pride and a striking contrast to the absolutist monarchies of its neighbours. However, this commitment to liberty contained a fatal flaw that would, over time, paralyse the government and contribute significantly to the Commonwealth's decline: the principle of unanimity, known as the liberum veto. The liberum veto was a parliamentary procedure that allowed any single deputy in the Sejm to block a legislative session and declare all legislation passed during that session null and void. The principle originated from the belief that all nobles were political equals and that the Sejm represented the unified will of the nation. Therefore, any opposition, even from a single voice, was seen as a sign that the consensus had not been reached. The initial intent of the liberum veto was to prevent the Sejm from passing legislation that was detrimental to the interests of the nobility or the state as a whole. It was meant to be a final check on potential abuses of power. For the first century of its existence, the liberum veto was used sparingly. Deputies, adhering to a culture of political responsibility, generally sought to reach a consensus. If a vote was blocked, the Sejm would typically reconvene and work to address the concerns of the dissenting member. However, in the mid-17th century, the political climate began to change. The first recorded use of the liberum veto to completely dissolve a Sejm was in 1652 by the deputy Władysław Szyszynski. This event set a dangerous precedent, transforming the veto from a tool of last resort into a weapon of political obstruction. The abuse of the liberum veto escalated rapidly in the late 17th and 18th centuries. Foreign powers, particularly Russia and Prussia, recognized its potential to destabilize the Commonwealth. They began to bribe deputies to exercise the veto, preventing the Sejm from passing crucial legislation, raising taxes for the army, or implementing vital reforms. The Sejm's inability to legislate effectively created a state of perpetual political paralysis, leaving the Commonwealth's government unable to address its mounting internal and external challenges. The liberum veto, once a symbol of noble liberty, had become the poison that was slowly destroying the state from within. The mid-17th century Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a multi-ethnic and religiously diverse state, faced a profound internal crisis on its vast southeastern frontier. The southern steppes, known as Ukraine, were home to the Cossacks, a semi-military society of frontiersmen. For generations, the Cossacks had served the Commonwealth as border guards and light cavalry in its wars against Muscovy and the Ottoman Empire. However, their relationship with the Commonwealth was deeply fraught, marked by simmering social, religious, and political grievances. The Commonwealth's noble-led society increasingly sought to impose a feudal system on the Cossacks, encroaching on their traditional freedoms and land rights. The Cossacks, who considered themselves a free military class, bitterly resented this erosion of their autonomy. Adding to the tension was a deep religious divide. The majority of the Cossacks were Eastern Orthodox, while the Commonwealth's ruling Szlachta was predominantly Catholic. The Cossacks viewed the Catholic hierarchy and the increasing influence of the Uniate Church, a hybrid Eastern and Western rite, as a form of cultural and religious oppression. This religious persecution, combined with economic exploitation by Polish magnates, created a volatile situation in the steppes. The spark that ignited this tinderbox was the personal grievances of Bohdan Khmelnytsky, a registered Cossack officer. Khmelnytsky was a landowner who, in a series of events, had his land confiscated by a Polish nobleman and his family subjected to assault. When his appeals for justice through the Commonwealth's legal system failed, he fled to the Zaporozhian Sich, the Cossack military stronghold beyond the Dnieper River rapids. There, he rallied the Cossacks, appealing to their shared sense of injustice and calling for a great rebellion against Polish rule. In early 1648, Khmelnytsky, with the support of the Crimean Tatars, launched a full-scale uprising. The rebellion, which began as a protest against social and religious injustice, quickly transformed into a devastating war for national autonomy. Khmelnytsky's Cossack army, with the invaluable assistance of Tatar light cavalry, was a formidable force. They were highly mobile, well-versed in steppe warfare, and driven by a fury born of long-standing oppression. The Commonwealth's army, unprepared for a full-scale rebellion and hampered by the political paralysis of the same, was initially routed in a series of major battles, including at Zhovty Vody, Korsun, and Pilyavtsi. These victories secured Khmelnytsky's control over a vast swath of the Commonwealth's southeastern territories. The Khmelnytsky uprising, therefore, was not a mere border incident, but a profound internal shock that would fundamentally weaken the Commonwealth and open the door to foreign intervention for decades to come. The Khmelnytsky uprising, which began in 1648, quickly evolved from a rebellion for Cossack autonomy into a devastating war for control of the Ukrainian lands. Bohdan Khmelnytsky's initial military successes against the Commonwealth's armies were so profound that he was able to secure a large and powerful state under his command. However, Khmelnytsky's position remained precarious. The Commonwealth, despite its initial defeats, was a formidable adversary that was determined to reclaim its lost territories. Furthermore, Khmelnytsky's alliance with the Crimean Tatars was opportunistic and unreliable. The Tatars, primarily interested in plunder and slaves, would often abandon the Cossacks at crucial moments and even raid their own villages, making them an unpredictable partner. Facing a war on two fronts and without a strong, reliable ally, Khmelnytsky began to seek a new protector. His overtures to the Ottoman Empire were initially rebuffed, as the Ottomans were wary of creating a new, powerful vassal state that could challenge their authority in the Black Sea region. This left Khmelnytsky with one remaining option: Muscovy. For years, Muscovy had watched the conflict on its western frontier with a mixture of fear and opportunism. Tsar Alexis I, a devout Orthodox Christian, was hesitant to involve Muscovy in a war with the Commonwealth, but was also increasingly swayed by the appeals of the Orthodox Cossacks, who shared his faith and looked to him as a potential liberator from Catholic oppression. In 1654, Khmelnytsky, after a series of secret negotiations, formally approached Tsar Alexis I with an offer to place the Cossack host under Muscovite protection. This led to the Treaty of Pereyaslav, a momentous event that would have profound and long-lasting consequences for the region. The treaty's terms were ambiguous and highly controversial. The Cossacks viewed the agreement as a military alliance and a recognition of their autonomy under the Tsar's protection, similar to their prior relationship with the Commonwealth. They were to be free to elect their own leaders, maintain their own army, and govern their own lands. However, Muscovy's interpretation of the treaty was entirely different. Tsar Alexis and his boyars saw the agreement as an act of vassalage, a complete and permanent transfer of Cossack allegiance and the Ukrainian lands to Muscovy. This clash of interpretations would define the future of the region and ignite a new and devastating war with the Commonwealth. The Treaty of Pereyaslav was not merely a diplomatic act. It was the great betrayal in the eyes of the Commonwealth nobility, as it was a direct challenge to their sovereignty and the first step in the slow but inexorable rise of Russian influence in the Cossack host. The mid-17th century was a period of unprecedented crisis for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Already embroiled in the devastating Khmelnytsky uprising and the subsequent war with Muscovy, the Commonwealth was plunged into a new and even more perilous conflict, the Swedish invasion of 1655, a conflict that became known in Polish history as the Deluge. This invasion, orchestrated by King Charles X Gustav of Sweden, was not a sudden act of aggression but the culmination of long-standing dynastic rivalries and geopolitical ambitions. The Vasa dynasty's claim to the Swedish throne, which had been a source of conflict since Sigismund III, Vasa's deposition provided the pretext for the invasion. Charles X Gustav, seeking to consolidate Sweden's control over the Baltic and establish a grand Swedish empire, saw the Commonwealth's internal weakness as a prime opportunity. The Commonwealth, exhausted by years of war with the Cossacks and Muscovy, was in a state of political and military disarray. The army was scattered, the treasury was depleted, and the nobility was paralysed by the abuse of the liberum veto and internal factionalism. The Swedish invasion was swift and devastatingly effective. In the summer of 1655, Swedish forces entered the Commonwealth from multiple directions, meeting little organised resistance. The Swedish army was a highly disciplined and professional force, veterans of the 30 Years' War, and was technologically superior to the Commonwealth's forces. They used modern tactics and were well equipped with firearms and artillery. The initial response from the Commonwealth's nobility was one of shock and betrayal. Instead of uniting to repel the invaders, some factions of the nobility, particularly in Greater Poland and Royal Prussia, chose to surrender to the Swedish king. They believed that Charles X Gustav, a fellow Protestant, would better protect their interests and restore order than their own monarchy, which they saw as weak and ineffective. This act of disloyalty, encapsulated by the capitulation at Ujsi, gave the Swedes a rapid and almost bloodless initial victory. Within a few months, the Swedish army had seized a vast portion of the Commonwealth's territory, capturing major cities like Warsaw and Krakow. King John II Casimir was forced to flee to Habsburg Silesia, and the Commonwealth appeared on the verge of total collapse. The Deluge was not merely a military invasion, it was a political and moral crisis that exposed the fundamental weaknesses of the noble republic. The king was a fugitive, the government was in disarray, and a significant portion of the nobility had betrayed their sovereign. This catastrophic period, however, would also spark a national resurgence and a period of determined resistance that would ultimately save the Commonwealth from complete annihilation. The initial phase of the Swedish invasion, known as the Deluge, was a period of profound crisis that forced King John II Casimir into a precarious position. Facing a swift and devastating assault from a technologically superior Swedish army, and with a significant portion of the nobility surrendering to the invaders, the king was unable to mount an effective defence. In a move of strategic retreat, John II Casimir and his court fled from Krakow and sought refuge in Habsburg-controlled Silesia. This flight was not an act of cowardice but a pragmatic necessity. It was an attempt to preserve the symbol of the monarchy and regroup in a safe haven from which a counter-offensive could be planned. From his exile, John II Casimir issued appeals to the nobility and the people, urging them to resist the occupation. However, the initial response was one of despair and apathy. The Commonwealth seemed to be on the verge of total collapse, with foreign armies occupying vast territories and the king a fugitive. The turning point in this desperate struggle was a single, defiant act of resistance that became a powerful symbol of national and religious resolve: the defence of the Jasna Gora monastery at Częstochowa. In November 1655, a small garrison of monks and volunteers, commanded by Prior Augustin Kordecki, prepared to defend the monastery against a far superior Swedish force. The monastery itself was a major religious and cultural centre, home to the Black Madonna icon, a revered object of national devotion. The Swedes, believing the monastery to be a source of a potential rebellion, laid siege to the fortress. The defence, which lasted over a month, was a remarkable feat of military and psychological resilience. The small garrison successfully repelled repeated assaults, despite being outnumbered and outgunned. The defence of Częstochowa was not a major military victory in the strategic sense, but its symbolic impact was immense. The fact that a small group of monks and volunteers could successfully hold off a professional, veteran army of the Swedish king provided a crucial spark of hope and defiance. The news of the victory spread quickly throughout the occupied lands, inspiring a national resurgence. The defence was framed not just as a military event, but as a religious miraculous sign of divine protection for the Commonwealth. This narrative, widely disseminated through sermons and pamphlets, galvanized the population and began to turn the tide of the war. John II, Casimir, seizing this moment of renewed spirit, returned to the Commonwealth and issued the Loire Oath in 1656, formally committing himself to the cause of resistance and promising to alleviate the plight of the peasantry, a vow that further solidified his support and rallied the nation against the foreign occupation. The defence of the Jasna Gora monastery and the subsequent national resurgence, while crucial for turning the tide of the deluge, did not immediately end the war. The conflict continued for several more years, transforming into a grueling war of attrition fought across the vast territories of the Commonwealth. By the late 1650s, all parties involved the Commonwealth, Sweden, Muscovy, and the Crimean Khanate were exhausted by the prolonged fighting. The political landscape was a complex web of shifting alliances and military stalemates, making a definitive military victory for any single power increasingly unlikely. This environment set the stage for a negotiated peace. The Treaty of Oliwa, signed in 1660, was the diplomatic culmination of this period. The peace negotiations were brokered by French diplomats, who were eager to stabilize the region and free up Swedish military resources for their own geopolitical objectives in Western Europe. The treaty brought an end to the long-standing conflict between the Commonwealth and Sweden, a rivalry that had defined the foreign policy of both nations for over half a century. Its terms were a mix of both Polish-Lithuanian territorial concessions and significant diplomatic gains. The most important provision of the Treaty of Oliwa was King John II, Casimir's formal and definitive renunciation of his claim to the Swedish throne. This act, while a personal and dynastic defeat, was a strategic necessity for the Commonwealth. It removed the primary pretext for the Swedish invasions and officially ended the Vasa dynasty's ambitions to rule both nations. In return, Sweden's king, Charles X Gustaf, also renounced his claim to the Polish throne. The treaty also led to a formal peace between the Commonwealth and Brandenburg Prussia. The Hohenzollern dynasty, which had ruled the Duchy of Prussia as a Polish fief, was now recognized as the sovereign ruler of an independent Duchy of Prussia. This was a catastrophic, long-term geopolitical loss for the Commonwealth. The emergence of a fully sovereign and independent Prussia on the Commonwealth's northern border created a new and formidable rival that would play a crucial role in the Commonwealth's eventual demise. The Treaty of Oliwa, therefore, marked a clear end to an era. The Commonwealth had survived the deluge, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. It had lost its suzerainty over Prussia, a loss that would prove fatal in the centuries to come, and its dynastic ties to the Swedish crown were permanently severed. The treaty did not resolve the ongoing war with Muscovy or the internal crises plaguing the Commonwealth, but it did end one of the most destructive and costly conflicts in its history, allowing the state to turn its full attention to the challenges that remained. The mid-17th century was a period of near-constant warfare for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The deluge, the Khmelnytsky uprising, and the subsequent wars with Muscovy and the Ottoman Empire had exhausted the state, leading to a period of political and economic decline. Against this backdrop of turmoil and uncertainty, a new figure emerged who would rise to become one of the most celebrated monarchs in the Commonwealth's history, John Sobieski. His ascent was not based on dynastic lineage, but on his military genius and his ability to command respect in a period when the government was plagued by internal conflicts and a weak monarchy. Sobieski was born into a prominent noble family in 1629 and received a comprehensive education, including extensive travel through Western Europe. He began his military career in the wars against the Cossacks and the Crimean Tatars, where he quickly distinguished himself as a brilliant cavalry commander. His experience in the southern and eastern frontiers, a crucible of constant conflict, gave him an intimate understanding of steppe warfare and the tactics of the Commonwealth's most dangerous adversaries. Sobieski's military acumen was further honed during the Deluge, where he fought on both sides of the conflict before eventually pledging his allegiance to King John II Casimir. His reputation grew throughout the 1660s and 1670s. As Grand Hetman of the Crown, the supreme military commander of the Polish army, he led a series of successful campaigns against the Ottoman Empire and its Tatar vassals. The Battle of Podaichi in 1667 was a key victory, where his forces, though outnumbered, successfully defended the Commonwealth's territory against a massive Tatar and Cossack army. This victory, and others like it, solidified his position as the shield of the Commonwealth and a national hero. In 1673, Sobieski achieved one of his most celebrated military triumphs at the Battle of Kotin. Leading a combined Polish and Lithuanian army, he launched a devastating surprise attack on the Ottoman army's fortified camp. The battle was a resounding victory, a testament to Sobieski's strategic genius and the effectiveness of the Commonwealth's heavy cavalry. The news of the victory reached the Sejm just as it was deliberating on a new monarch, as King Michał Korybut Wiśniowski had recently passed away. The prestige and popularity gained from this victory were a decisive factor in Sobieski's election. In 1674, the Sejm elected him King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, officially recognizing the military leader who had, for years, been the true power behind the throne. His reign, therefore, began not with a promise of peace, but with a legacy of warfare and a clear mandate to defend the Commonwealth from its enemies. The reign of King John III Sobieski began in the shadow of constant conflict, particularly on the southern frontier with the Ottoman Empire. The ongoing state of war, marked by military pressure from the Ottomans and their Crimean Tatar vassals, required Sobieski to maintain a strong military posture and engage in a series of defensive campaigns. While he was a seasoned and successful military commander, the political paralysis of the Commonwealth Sejm, hampered by the liberum veto and internal factionalism, made it difficult to secure consistent funding for a large standing army. Sobieski's political and military efforts were a constant struggle against a government that could not act decisively. This precarious situation reached a crisis point in 1683. The Ottoman Empire, under the leadership of Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, launched a massive and ambitious offensive into Central Europe. Their primary target was Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg Empire, a city whose fall would have dramatically shifted the geopolitical balance of power in Europe. Emperor Leopold I, recognizing the existential threat, appealed to the European powers for assistance. The response was the formation of the Holy League, a military alliance that included the Habsburg Empire, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and various German states. The Commonwealth's participation in this alliance was a strategic necessity and a diplomatic triumph for Sobieski. The king understood that Vienna's fall would inevitably expose the Commonwealth to a subsequent Ottoman invasion on a scale from which it could not recover. In a decisive political act, Sobieski secured the Sejm's approval for a major military expedition. Leading a large army, he marched south to join the Holy League's forces. This march was a remarkable feat of logistics and command, with Sobieski's army, including a formidable contingent of the winged hussars, travelling over 350 kilometres in less than 3 weeks. The siege of Vienna had been underway since July 1683. The city's defences were strained to the breaking point, and a relief army was the only hope for its survival. On September 12, 1683, the combined forces of the Holy League, under the supreme command of King John III Sobieski, launched a massive assault on the Ottoman siege lines. The decisive moment came when Sobieski, leading a charge of approximately 30 hussars and other heavy cavalry, descended from the Kallenberg Hills. The charge was an overwhelming success, shattering the Ottoman forces and forcing them into a panicked retreat. The battle was a resounding victory for the Holy League, a testament to Sobieski's strategic genius and the unparalleled might of the Hussars in a shock charge. The Battle of Vienna cemented Sobieski's reputation as a national hero and the saviour of Vienna, but it would also prove to be the last great triumph for the winged cavalry and the Commonwealth on the European stage. The triumphant victory at the Battle of Vienna in 1683, while securing King John III Sobieski's legacy as a military hero, did not translate into a lasting strategic advantage for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In fact, the victory initiated a new phase of geopolitical reality for the Commonwealth, one defined by the enormous cost of victory and the shift in the balance of power in Central and Eastern Europe. The battle and the subsequent campaigns of the Holy League against the Ottoman Empire drew the Commonwealth into a prolonged war that it was ill-equipped to sustain. The immediate consequence of the victory was a new, costly war with the Ottoman Empire. For the next 16 years, the Commonwealth was a committed member of the Holy League, fighting alongside the Habsburgs and Venice in a series of grueling and expensive campaigns. The same, plagued by political paralysis and the abuse of the liberum veto, proved incapable of raising the necessary taxes to fund a prolonged war. This financial instability forced the Commonwealth to rely on foreign subsidies and loans, particularly from the papacy and the Habsburgs, to keep its army in the field. This dependency, in turn, compromised the Commonwealth's diplomatic independence. Furthermore, the campaigns of the Holy League, while successfully pushing the Ottomans out of Central Europe, did not result in significant territorial gains for the Commonwealth. The Habsburgs and Venice reaped most of the benefits, expanding their territories in the Balkans and along the Adriatic. The Commonwealth's army, which bore a significant burden of the fighting, often found itself on the defensive, tasked with protecting its own southern frontiers from Tatar raids and Ottoman counter-offensives. The protracted nature of the war and the lack of a clear strategic benefit led to a growing sense of frustration and disillusionment among the nobility. The political situation at home was also in a state of decay. Sobieski's attempts to strengthen the monarchy and secure a stable succession for his son were met with fierce opposition from a powerful faction of magnates, particularly the Sapieha family of Lithuania. This internal conflict, often driven by foreign bribes and dynastic rivalries, paralyzed the government and prevented the implementation of vital reforms. The Commonwealth's political system, once a source of pride, had become a liability. The victorious Sobieski was a monarch without the means to govern effectively, and the Commonwealth, despite its military triumph, was in a state of terminal decline. The victory at Vienna, far from being a strategic solution, had only temporarily masked the deeper institutional and political problems that were corroding the state from within. The death of King John III Sobieski in 1696 plunged the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth into a profound political crisis, initiating another interregnum. Unlike previous succession crises, this one was marked by an unprecedented level of foreign interference, as the Commonwealth's neighbours, particularly Russia and Prussia, began to view the elective monarchy not as a nuisance, but as a strategic tool to assert their influence. The contest for the empty throne became a proxy war between competing European powers, each seeking to install a candidate who would serve their own geopolitical interests and keep the Commonwealth weak and politically paralysed. The three primary contenders for the crown were James Sobieski, the eldest son of the late king, Prince François Louis de Conti, a French prince with significant diplomatic backing, and Frederick Augustus, the Elector of Saxony. The candidacy of James Sobieski was a source of great domestic hope, but was met with fierce opposition from powerful magnate families, such as the Sapiehas, who feared the establishment of a hereditary dynasty. The Sejm's political paralysis, caused by the factions supporting and opposing the Sobieski family, prevented the election from proceeding smoothly. The candidacy of the French Prince de Conti was a direct challenge to the Habsburgs and other Central European powers. France, seeking to extend its diplomatic influence in the East, invested significant resources in promoting Conti's election. His candidacy was supported by a faction of the nobility who sought to reorient the Commonwealth's foreign policy away from the Habsburgs. However, Conti was a distant figure who lacked a strong base of support within the Commonwealth itself. Frederick Augustus of Saxony proved to be the most successful of the candidates. His election was a culmination of extensive political maneuvering and outright bribery. He leveraged his immense wealth as the Elector of Saxony to finance his campaign, distributing vast sums to the nobility who comprised the electoral Sejm. He also had the crucial diplomatic backing of the Russian Tsar Peter the Great and the support of the Habsburgs, who viewed him as a more acceptable and pliable candidate than either Sobieski or Conti. He converted to Catholicism to make his candidacy viable and promised to uphold all the privileges and liberties of the nobility. The election of Frederick Augustus in 1697 was a moment of deep national humiliation. He was not elected through a clear consensus, but through a process rife with corruption and foreign intrigue. His subsequent reign, as Augustus II, was defined by the dual nature of his rule as both King of Poland and Elector of Saxony, and by a constant struggle to balance the interests of his hereditary lands with the constitutional limitations of the Commonwealth's elective throne. The interregnum's chaos had effectively paved the way for the slow but inexorable rise of foreign influence, which would ultimately lead to the Commonwealth's demise. The election of Frederick Augustus of Saxony as King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania in 1697 marked the beginning of a new dynastic era for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. His reign, as Augustus II, was defined by the dual nature of his rule as the hereditary Elector of Saxony and the elected monarch of a noble republic. This dual role created an inherent conflict of interest. Augustus was a powerful and ambitious ruler in his hereditary lands, where he governed as an absolute monarch. In the Commonwealth, however, he was constrained by Henry's articles and the powerful nobility who had elected him. This fundamental tension between absolutist ambition and constitutional limitation would define his reign and the subsequent rule of his son, Augustus III. Augustus II's primary foreign policy objective was to use the Commonwealth's resources and manpower to advance the interests of Saxony. He saw the Commonwealth as a strategic pawn in the broader geopolitical struggles of the era, particularly the Great Northern War. He entered into a secret alliance with Peter the Great of Russia and the King of Denmark to attack Sweden, hoping to reclaim lost territories for Saxony and extend his influence in the Baltic. This decision, however, was made without the consent of the Sejm and plunged the Commonwealth into a devastating war for which it was ill prepared. The Great Northern War, which began in 1700, was a catastrophic period for the Commonwealth. The war was fought largely on Polish and Lithuanian territory, with armies from Sweden, Russia, and Saxony marching across the land. The Commonwealth, unable to act as a unified state, was split into factions. A pro-Swedish faction supported by King Charles XII of Sweden even went so far as to depose Augustus II and elect a puppet king, Stanisław Leszczyński, in 1704. The Commonwealth was effectively a battleground and a client state, its sovereignty a casualty of foreign military intervention. This period of instability exposed the full extent of the Commonwealth's institutional decay. The Sejm, paralysed by the liberum veto and foreign bribery, could not raise the taxes needed to fund an army. The military, which had once been the envy of Europe, was a shadow of its former self, a consequence of decades of underfunding and political neglect. The Saxon kings, with their absolutist ambitions and focus on their hereditary lands, did little to address the root causes of the Commonwealth's decline. Instead, they relied on Russian military support to maintain their grip on the throne, a dependency that gave Peter the Great and his successors an unprecedented level of influence over the Commonwealth's internal affairs. The reign of the Saxon kings, therefore, marked a period of profound political and military decline, solidifying the Commonwealth's position as a puppet state of its more powerful neighbours. The Great Northern War, a major European conflict lasting from 1700 to 1721, was a catastrophic period for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Unlike its past wars, this was not a conflict the Commonwealth chose to enter as a unified state, but one it was plunged into by the dynastic ambitions of its elected monarch, Augustus II. As Elector of Saxony, Augustus entered into a secret alliance with Peter the Great of Russia and Frederick IV of Denmark to attack the Swedish Empire. His primary goal was to use the war as a means to seize Livonia for Saxony and strengthen his own position within the Commonwealth. This decision, made without the Sejm's consent, effectively made the Commonwealth a battleground for foreign powers. The war began with Augustus II's ill-fated invasion of Swedish Livonia in 1700. The initial campaign was a failure, and the Swedish king, Charles XII, a brilliant and aggressive military commander, responded by invading the Commonwealth. The Swedish army, a highly professional and disciplined force, was able to march across Polish and Lithuanian territory with little organized resistance. The Commonwealth's army, a shadow of its former self due to decades of underfunding and political neglect, was no match for the Swedes. The Sejm, paralyzed by the liberum veto and internal factionalism, was unable to raise the taxes and troops needed for a defense. The Commonwealth was soon fractured by the conflict. A faction of the nobility, angered by Augustus II's actions, formed the Warsaw Confederation and allied with Charles XII. In 1704, with Swedish military support, this faction deposed Augustus II and elected a puppet king, Stanisław Leszczyński. This created a situation of two rival kings and two competing governments, with the Commonwealth effectively serving as a battlefield and a political pawn for the ambitions of Sweden and Russia. Armies from all three nations marched across its territory, causing immense destruction and economic ruin. The war exposed the terminal institutional decay of the Commonwealth. The liberum veto and the power of the magnates had created a state incapable of self-defense. The Commonwealth's sovereignty was effectively a fiction, as its political decisions were dictated by the military presence of foreign powers. Following the decisive Russian victory over Sweden at the Battle of Poltava in 1709, Augustus II, with the backing of Peter the Great, was restored to the throne. The war did not end, but the balance of power had shifted dramatically. The Commonwealth was no longer caught between two great powers, but had become a vassal state of a newly dominant Russian Empire. The conclusion of the Great Northern War in 1721 left the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in a state of profound political and military humiliation. While the war itself had ended, the consequences of its being fought on Commonwealth territory and the political interference of foreign powers were just beginning to be felt. The war had not only physically devastated the country, but had also created a power vacuum that was eagerly filled by Russia. Tsar Peter the Great, having decisively defeated Sweden, was now the dominant power in the region and viewed the Commonwealth as a de facto vassal state. This new reality was brutally and symbolically demonstrated in 1717 with an event that would become known as the Silent Sejm. The Sejm of 1717 was a direct result of a period of renewed civil war within the Commonwealth. King Augustus II, restored to his throne with Russian support, attempted to introduce absolutist reforms and strengthen his position, particularly by bringing his Saxon army into the Commonwealth. This was met with fierce opposition from a confederation of nobility, led by the Tarnogrod Confederation, who feared the loss of their cherished golden liberty. The standoff between the king and the nobility threatened to reignite a full-scale civil war. In a pivotal act of intervention, Peter the Great of Russia, under the guise of mediation, stepped in to resolve the conflict. He sent Russian troops into the Commonwealth and dictated the terms of a settlement known as the Warsaw Agreement between the king and the nobility. This agreement was presented to the Sejm, which was surrounded by Russian troops, giving the appearance of a free assembly, while in reality being a coercive act of foreign policy. The Sejm lasted for a single day. To prevent any use of the liberum veto or any debate that might challenge the Russian-dictated terms, the Sejm was not permitted to speak. The Marshal of the Sejm, Stanisław Ledachowski, was the only one allowed to read out the terms of the agreement. The deputies sat in complete silence, without a single word of debate or dissent. The silence of the Sejm was not a sign of consensus, but of complete and utter political humiliation. The Russian-imposed agreement formally limited the size of the Commonwealth's army to 24, 0 troops, a force far too small to defend its vast borders. It also restricted the powers of the Saxon king, but most importantly, it permanently enshrined Russia as the Commonwealth's guarantor and arbiter of its internal affairs. The Silent Sen was a symbolic moment that demonstrated the loss of the Commonwealth's sovereignty and its descent into a client state of the Russian Empire. The Silent Sejm of 1717 was a watershed moment, but it was by no means the end of the Commonwealth's decline. The Russian-imposed peace that followed marked the beginning of a period where the Commonwealth's sovereignty was systematically eroded by its two most ambitious neighbours, Russia and Prussia. The Russian Empire, having established itself as the Commonwealth's guarantor, now had a legal pretext to intervene in its internal affairs at will. This was a form of political control, far more insidious and effective than outright conquest. Russia's objective was not to annex the Commonwealth outright, but to keep it weak, politically paralysed, and a buffer state for its own security interests. Prussia, under its Hohenzollern rulers, had also emerged as a major power in the region. Having gained full sovereignty over the Duchy of Prussia in the Treaty of Oliwa, the Prussian kingdom now had ambitions of its own. It sought to expand its territory at the Commonwealth's expense, particularly in the western regions that would connect its core lands with the newly acquired territories. The Prussian-Russian alliance, forged in a series of treaties in the 1720s and 1730s, formalized a shared goal of maintaining the Commonwealth's institutional decay. Both powers agreed to uphold the status quo, including the crippling liberum veto, and to prevent any meaningful reforms that might strengthen the Polish-Lithuanian state. This period was one of profound political humiliation. The Commonwealth's elections, once a source of national pride, became a battleground for foreign intervention. The election of Augustus III in 1733, for example, was secured only after a brief civil war, known as the War of the Polish Succession, in which Russian and Saxon troops intervened to depose the rival candidate, Stanisław Leszczyński. The result was a king who owed his throne to foreign military force and was therefore entirely subservient to the will of Russia. The Sejm, once the bulwark of noble liberty, was now a tool of foreign policy. Russian ambassadors, in particular, exerted a veto over its proceedings, either through bribery or by using the threat of military force. A single Russian diplomat could effectively halt all legislative activity, making it impossible for the government to act decisively. This degradation of political institutions had a direct impact on the Commonwealth's military and economy. The army, limited to 24, 0 men by the Silent Sejm, was too small and underfunded to defend its vast borders. The economy, already struggling from a century of war, stagnated under the weight of foreign occupation and political paralysis. The Commonwealth, a once great power, was now a hollow state, a relic of its former glory whose fate was decided not in its own capital but in the palaces of St. Petersburg and Berlin. The political humiliation of the Silent Sejm and the subsequent degradation of the Commonwealth's sovereignty did not extinguish the spirit of the nation. Instead, the mid-18th century witnessed a remarkable intellectual and political awakening. This period, coinciding with the broader European Enlightenment, saw the rise of a new generation of reformers who were acutely aware of the Commonwealth's terminal decline and were determined to save the state from itself. These reformers were a diverse group, including enlightened monarchs, influential magnates, and a growing class of patriotic intellectuals who recognized that the old political order of the noble republic was no longer viable in an age of absolutist neighbours. The reform movement was fueled by a growing body of intellectual and political literature. Pamphlets, books, and public debates began to dissect the fundamental flaws of the Commonwealth's political system. The liberum veto was correctly identified as a primary source of the government's paralysis, and the corrupting influence of foreign powers was openly discussed. The reformers advocated for a stronger, more centralized government, a larger and more professional army, and a more equitable social structure that would include the urban burghers and the peasantry in the national project. They looked to the constitutional models of Western Europe, particularly Great Britain and France, for inspiration, seeking to modernize the Commonwealth's political institutions. A key figure in this period was Stanisław Konarski, a Catholic priest and educator. In 1740, he founded the Collegium Nobilium, a modern boarding school for the sons of the nobility, which aimed to instill in its students a new sense of patriotism, civic duty, and enlightened thought. Konarski's reforms of the educational system, which focused on the natural sciences, history, and modern languages, were instrumental in creating a generation of leaders who were prepared to challenge the political inertia of the past. His work was part of a broader cultural renewal that emphasized rationalism, public service, and a critical re-evaluation of the Commonwealth's traditions. The reform movement also gained traction with the accession of the new king, Stanisław August Poniatowski, in 1764. Poniatowski, a former lover of Catherine the Great and a product of the Enlightenment himself, was initially installed on the throne by Russian influence. However, he quickly proved to be a monarch with a genuine desire to reform and revitalize the state. His reign became a period of intense reform efforts as he sought to modernize the army, reform the treasury, and strengthen the central government. The final push for national revival had begun, but it was taking place under the watchful and increasingly hostile eyes of its neighboring powers. The reign of Stanisław August Poniatowski, from 1764 to 1795, was a period of profound paradox for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He was a monarch who, despite being placed on the throne by a foreign power, harbored a genuine and enlightened vision for his nation's revival. His election was a direct consequence of Russian political interference. As a former lover of Empress Catherine the Great and a member of a pro-Russian faction of the nobility, he was the ideal candidate for Petersburg, a ruler who was expected to be compliant and subservient to Russian interests. His accession, therefore, was a clear demonstration of the Commonwealth's loss of sovereignty. However, Poniatowski was not a simple puppet. He was a product of the European Enlightenment, a man of letters and a patron of the arts and sciences. He immediately recognized the terminal decline of his nation and sought to use his position to enact a series of radical reforms aimed at modernizing the state. His reign became a period of intense reform efforts as he tried to strengthen the central government, modernize the army, and reform the treasury. He was a patron of the arts and sciences, and his court in Warsaw became a hub of intellectual and cultural life, attracting some of the most prominent thinkers and artists of the era. The royal palace and its surrounding gardens became symbols of a national cultural renewal, a defiant statement against the political humiliation of the Silent Sejm and the foreign dominance that had plagued the Commonwealth for decades. Poniatowski's reform efforts were met with fierce opposition from several quarters. The conservative nobility, who feared the loss of their cherished golden liberty and the privileges that came with it, saw his reforms as an attack on their constitutional rights. They were particularly opposed to any attempt to limit the liberum veto or to create a stronger, more centralized government. This opposition was actively encouraged and financed by Russia and Prussia, who viewed any attempt to strengthen the Commonwealth as a direct threat to their own geopolitical ambitions. Catherine the Great, in particular, saw Poniatowski's reformist zeal as a betrayal of her trust and a dangerous precedent that could lead to the Commonwealth's independence. Despite the political paralysis and foreign opposition, Poniatowski, working with a core group of enlightened reformers, achieved some notable successes. He oversaw the creation of the Commission of National Education, the first secular ministry of education in Europe, and the modernization of the army. However, these successes were always fragile and constantly undermined by external pressure. The reign of Stanisław August Poniatowski was, therefore, an impossible task. A monarch of the Enlightenment trying to save a state that was being systematically destroyed by the very powers that had put him on the throne. The reign of King Stanisław August Poniatowski, despite his enlightened intentions, did not begin a period of peaceful reform. Instead, his reformist zeal and his close ties to Russia sparked a conservative backlash among a significant portion of the Commonwealth's nobility. This opposition, fearful of losing their cherished golden liberty and viewing the king as a Russian puppet, coalesced into a military and political movement known as the Bar Confederation. This confederation, formed in 1768 in the town of Bar in Podolia, was an armed uprising aimed at reversing Poniatowski's reforms and restoring the old political order. The Confederation's stated goals were to defend the Catholic faith, preserve the traditional noble liberties, and resist Russian influence. This was a profound paradox. A rebellion against a king who was a Russian favourite was itself a conservative movement that sought to maintain the very political system that had made the Commonwealth so vulnerable to foreign manipulation. The Confederates were particularly incensed by a series of decrees, known as the Cardinal Laws, that were forced upon the same by the Russian ambassador Nikolai Repnin. These laws, while guaranteeing a measure of religious toleration for Orthodox and Protestant citizens, were seen by the Confederates as an act of foreign coercion that violated the Commonwealth sovereignty. The Confederates viewed Poniatowski as an enabler of this foreign meddling, and their uprising was a direct challenge to his authority. The Bar Confederation was a protracted and brutal civil war that lasted for 4 years. The Confederates, a large but disorganized force of noble volunteers, engaged in a series of grueling military campaigns against the Commonwealth's Royal Army and, most importantly, against Russian forces. The war was fought across the Commonwealth's vast territory, particularly in the eastern and southern provinces. Despite their bravery, the Confederates were no match for the professional Russian army. Their military tactics, which relied on guerrilla warfare and poorly organized skirmishes, were ultimately ineffective against a disciplined and well-funded military machine. The war had a catastrophic impact on the Commonwealth. It drained the nation's resources, caused immense destruction, and further exposed the state's terminal political paralysis. The uprising was ultimately a failure. By 1772, the Bar Confederation was militarily defeated, and its leaders were forced into exile. The consequences of this failed rebellion were far-reaching and fatal. Russia, Prussia, and Austria, which had been observing the chaos with keen interest, saw the Civil War as the final proof of the Commonwealth's inability to govern itself. The Bar Confederation, intended to be a restoration of the old order, instead provided the very pretext for the first partition of Poland, a cataclysmic event that would begin the process of the Commonwealth's dismemberment. The collapse of the Bar Confederation in 1772, following a protracted civil war that had ravaged the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth for 4 years, provided the final pretext for its 3 great neighbours, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, to act on their long-held territorial ambitions. The chaos and political paralysis of the Bar Confederation's rebellion convinced these powers, particularly Empress Catherine the Great of Russia and King Frederick the Great of Prussia, that the Commonwealth was incapable of governing itself. The Civil War was presented as the final proof of the Commonwealth's institutional failure, justifying foreign intervention not as a predatory act, but as a necessary measure to restore order and stability in the region. The idea of partitioning the Commonwealth was not new. It had been discussed informally for decades among the royal courts of Europe, but the Bar Confederation provided the necessary spark. In 1772, Russia and Prussia, with the reluctant acquiescence of Austria, formally agreed to a treaty that would annex significant portions of the Commonwealth's territory. This was a classic act of 18th century realpolitik, where the weak were sacrificed to maintain a balance of power among the strong. The treaty was signed in St. Petersburg, and the Commonwealth was presented with a fait accompli. The terms of the first partition were as follows. Russia, having already established its military presence during the Civil War, annexed a vast swathe of the Commonwealth's eastern territories, including parts of Livonia, Vitebsk, Polotsk, and Mstislavl. These lands were predominantly Eastern Orthodox and were strategically important for consolidating Russia's western border. Prussia, under Frederick the Great, made a crucial territorial gain. It annexed Royal Prussia, including the region of Warmia, which connected its core Brandenburg lands with the Duchy of Prussia. This territorial acquisition was a strategic masterstroke for Prussia, giving it control over the Vistula River and the lucrative grain trade flowing to the Baltic, and making it a contiguous and formidable state. Austria, seeking to maintain its influence and not be left out of the spoils, annexed the southern region of Galicia. The Commonwealth, having been reduced in size and power, was then forced to ratify this partition in the Partition Sejm of 1773. The Sejm, convened under intense foreign pressure and surrounded by Russian troops, was a scene of political intimidation and bribery. Despite the heroic resistance of a small number of patriotic deputies, led by Tadeusz Rejtan, the Sejm was forced to give its consent to the treaty. The first partition of Poland was a cataclysmic event that stripped the Commonwealth of a third of its population and a third of its territory. It was the first act of a tragedy that would not end until the Commonwealth had been completely erased from the map of Europe. The first partition of 1772, while a catastrophic event, did not lead to the immediate collapse of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Instead, it served as a profound shock to the nation, an undeniable proof that its political system was failing and that radical change was necessary for its survival. This realization, coupled with a period of political instability among the partitioning powers, created a unique window of opportunity for a generation of enlightened reformers to mount a last-ditch effort to save the Republic. This effort would be centered on the convocation of a special parliamentary session that would come to be known as the Great Sejm. The Great Sejm, also called the Four-Year Sejm, met from 1788 to 1792. It was a period of unprecedented reformist fervour, as a patriotic faction of the nobility, supported by King Stanislaw August Poniatowski, seized the initiative to enact sweeping changes to the Commonwealth's constitution. This reform movement was made possible by a temporary weakening of Russian influence. Empress Catherine the Great was preoccupied with a war against the Ottoman Empire and was unable to fully exert her control over the Commonwealth's political life. The Sejm, therefore, was able to operate with a degree of freedom not seen for a century. The reformers of the Great Sejm were a diverse group of intellectuals, magnates, and gentry. They sought to dismantle the institutional flaws that had made the Commonwealth so vulnerable. Their primary target was the liberum veto. They correctly identified this procedure as the source of governmental paralysis and political corruption, and they worked to replace it with a system of majority rule. The reformers also advocated for a stronger central government, a more professional and larger army, and a more equitable social system that would give burghers and peasants a greater stake in the nation. The most significant achievement of the Great Sejm was the passage of the May-3rd Constitution in 1791. This landmark document, the first modern constitution in Europe, was a direct consequence of the Sejm's reformist efforts. It was a bold attempt to transform the Commonwealth from a noble republic into a constitutional monarchy. It abolished the liberum veto, established a stronger executive branch, and gave legal rights to the burghers. The constitution was a revolutionary act of self-preservation, a final and desperate attempt to modernize the state and save it from its external enemies. The Great Sejm was a moment of profound national renewal, but its promise of a new and reformed Commonwealth would be met with a swift and brutal military response from the partitioning powers. The Great Sejm, which began its deliberations in 1788, was a period of intense reformist fervour, but its most significant and enduring legacy was the passage of the May-3rd Constitution in 1791. This document was a revolutionary act of self-preservation, a desperate attempt by a nation in decline to modernize its political system and secure its survival. It was a product of the European Enlightenment, and its authors, a coalition of enlightened magnates, gentry, and King Stanislaw August Poniatowski, sought to dismantle the institutional flaws that had made the Commonwealth so vulnerable. The Constitution was a bold and radical departure from the traditions of the noble republic, and its passage represented a final, defiant gasp of a nation on the brink of dismemberment. The Constitution's primary objective was to replace the system of anarchy and paralysis with a more functional and centralized government. The The most significant provision was the abolition of the liberum veto and the introduction of a system of majority rule in the same. This single act, a direct challenge to the cherished golden liberty of the nobility, was intended to restore the government's ability to legislate and act decisively. The constitution also abolished the election of monarchs, replacing it with a hereditary monarchy. This was a crucial reform, as it was intended to end the chaotic interregnums and the constant foreign interference that had plagued the Commonwealth for centuries. The Saxon House of Wettin was designated as the new hereditary dynasty, a choice that was seen as a way to secure the support of a powerful neighbour and to avoid future succession crises. Furthermore, the Maithreid constitution sought to create a more equitable social and political system. It granted extensive rights to the burghers of the royal free cities, giving them a voice in the same and protecting their property and trade rights. This was a revolutionary reform that sought to include a new social class in the national project and to create a stronger, more unified nation. The constitution also placed the peasantry, who were at the bottom of the social hierarchy, under the protection of the state. While it did not abolish serfdom outright, it was a significant step towards a more humane and just social order. The Maithreid constitution was the first modern constitution in Europe and the second in the world after the United States Constitution. It was a beacon of hope for the nation, a blueprint for a modern constitutional monarchy that would be able to defend itself from its external enemies. However, its promise was short-lived. The passage of the constitution was met with fierce opposition from a faction of conservative nobility and, more importantly, with a swift and brutal military response from the partitioning powers. The Maithreid constitution, a symbol of national renewal, instead provided the final pretext for the Commonwealth's total annihilation. The passage of the Maithreid constitution in 1791 was a revolutionary act of self-preservation, a final, desperate attempt to modernize the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The constitution's reforms, the abolition of the liberum veto, the establishment of a hereditary monarchy, and the extension of rights to burghers, represented a direct challenge to the political system that had long benefited a conservative faction of the nobility. This opposition, fearful of losing their power and privileges, refused to accept the new law and turned to a foreign power for support. This faction, known as the Targowica Confederation, formally requested Russian military intervention to restore the old order and protect the golden liberty that the constitution had so audaciously dismantled. This plea for foreign intervention was exactly the pretext that Empress Catherine the Great had been waiting for. She viewed the Maithreid constitution as a dangerous and hostile precedent, a sign that the Commonwealth was attempting to escape its status as a Russian client state. A strong, reformed Commonwealth on her western border was a threat to Russian security and her own geopolitical ambitions. In May 1792, a massive Russian army with a force of approximately 100 troops crossed into the Commonwealth. This was not a punitive expedition, but a full-scale invasion aimed at destroying the new constitution and reasserting Russian dominance. The Commonwealth's response was a military campaign known as the War in Defense of the Constitution. The Commonwealth's army, which had been undergoing a process of modernization, was a small and outmatched force. It numbered only around 50, troops, and was no match for the professional and veteran Russian military machine. The war was a series of unequal and devastating battles. Despite the bravery and strategic acumen of commanders like Prince Józef Poniatowski, King Stanisław August's nephew, and Tadeusz Kościuszko, a veteran of the American Revolutionary War, the Commonwealth's army was forced into a series of strategic retreats. The Battle of Zielenice, though a tactical victory for the Commonwealth, did little to stem the overwhelming Russian advance. The war ended in a political rather than a military defeat. King Stanisław August Poniatowski, facing an impossible military situation and believing that further resistance would lead to the total annihilation of his country, made the fateful decision to capitulate. He ordered his army to cease fighting and joined the Targowica Confederation, effectively betraying the constitution that he himself had helped to create. This act of capitulation was a catastrophic blow. The Maithreid constitution, a symbol of national hope, was formally annulled. and the Commonwealth's final, desperate attempt at revival had failed. The country was once again a Russian puppet state, and the stage was set for a final, irreversible dismemberment. The capitulation of King Stanisław August Poniatowski and the subsequent victory of the Targowica Confederation and its Russian allies in the war in defense of the constitution sealed the fate of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The annulment of the May 3rd constitution was a catastrophic blow to the nation's final attempt at self-preservation. The victorious powers, having crushed the reformist movement, saw the Commonwealth not as a sovereign state, but as a political vacuum ready for exploitation. The stage was set for the second partition of Poland, a direct consequence of the war and the constitutional crisis. The idea for a new partition was primarily the work of Prussia, led by King Frederick William II. Prussia, which had been a reluctant ally of Poland during the war, now saw an opportunity to gain more territory. The Prussian king argued that the chaos of the war and the persistent threat of Polish nationalism justified a second partition. Empress Catherine the Great of Russia, having militarily secured her dominance, readily agreed. The second partition was a purely predatory act, with no pretense of restoring order or stabilizing the region. It was a clear demonstration of the Commonwealth's complete loss of sovereignty. The treaty for the second partition was signed by Russia and Prussia in 1793. Austria, which was preoccupied with its own political struggles and a war with revolutionary France, did not participate in this round of the plunder. The territorial annexations were immense. Russia, as the dominant power, took the lion's share. It annexed a vast portion of the Commonwealth's eastern territories, including a large part of Belarus and Ukraine. These lands were home to millions of Orthodox Christians, and their annexation served Russia's dual purpose of religious and territorial expansion. Prussia, for its part, annexed a large portion of western Poland, including the cities of Gdańsk and Torun and the region of Greater Poland. This was a crucial strategic acquisition for Prussia, as it completed the territorial link between its core lands and its territories in East Prussia, creating a contiguous and formidable state. The remaining rump state of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was reduced to a small, politically paralyzed, and militarily insignificant country. It was now fully a client state of Russia, with its every political move dictated by the Russian ambassador in Warsaw. The Sejm of 1793, known as the Grodno Sejm, was the final parliamentary session of the Commonwealth. Convened under immense foreign pressure, the Sejm was forced to ratify the partition treaties. The deputies, surrounded by Russian and Prussian troops, and subject to intense bribery and intimidation, were compelled to give their consent. The second partition was a decisive step in the Commonwealth's final annihilation, leaving it a hollow shell of a state, utterly helpless and awaiting its final end. The second partition of 1793, forced upon the Commonwealth by Russia and Prussia, was a final and unendurable humiliation. It stripped the state of a third of its remaining territory and reduced it to a powerless client of the Russian Empire. The Grodno Sejm, which was convened under intense foreign pressure to ratify the partition treaties, was the ultimate symbol of the Commonwealth's loss of sovereignty. This act of foreign plunder and national betrayal, however, did not extinguish the spirit of Polish patriotism. Instead, it ignited a final, desperate act of defiance: the Kosciuszko Uprising. Tadeusz Kościuszko, a veteran of the American Revolutionary War and a brilliant military engineer and strategist, was the central figure of this rebellion. Having distinguished himself in the war in defense of the Constitution, Kościuszko had fled into exile following King Stanisław August Poniatowski's capitulation. From his exile, he rallied support for a new uprising, believing that only a full-scale national rebellion could save the Commonwealth from its final annihilation. His vision for the uprising was not merely a military campaign but a social revolution. He recognized that the old political order, which excluded the peasantry and the urban burghers, was no longer viable. For a nation to be saved, it had to include all of its people in the national project. The uprising began on March 24, 1794, when Kościuszko issued the Act of Uprising in Krakow, officially declaring his intention to fight for the nation's independence. He was proclaimed supreme commander of all Polish forces, and he immediately began to rally support. His vision of a national uprising was most clearly articulated in the proclamation of Połaniec, a revolutionary decree that granted the peasantry a measure of personal freedom, reduced their feudal obligations, and placed them under the protection of the state. This was a radical and unprecedented act, an attempt to transform a military rebellion into a genuine social movement and to gain the support of the vast peasant population. The first major confrontation of the uprising was the Battle of Rakławieś on April 4, 1794. Kosciuszko's forces, a small and poorly equipped army of regular troops and peasant volunteers armed with scythes, faced a more numerous and professional Russian army. Kosciuszko's plan was a bold one. He used the terrain to his advantage and launched a devastating frontal assault on the Russian artillery positions. The peasant scythe-bearers, driven by a fury born of long-standing oppression, charged the Russian guns and captured them in a heroic and decisive action. The battle was a tactical victory for Kosciuszko's forces, and while it did not change the overall strategic situation, it had an immense symbolic impact. It provided a crucial spark of hope and defiance, proving that the Commonwealth, even in its final hours, could still fight and win. The victory at the Battle of Rakławieś, while a crucial symbolic triumph for the Kosciuszko uprising, did not change the overall strategic reality. The Commonwealth's army, a small and poorly equipped force of regular troops and peasant volunteers, was no match for the overwhelming military might of Russia and Prussia. The uprising was, from its inception, a desperate struggle against impossible odds, and its fate was sealed by a series of military setbacks and a lack of consistent foreign support. Kosciuszko, having demonstrated his strategic acumen at Rakławieś, was forced to contend with the immense numerical superiority of his adversaries. The Russian army, under the command of General Alexander Suvorov, was a highly professional, veteran force that was determined to crush the rebellion quickly. At the same time, Prussia, having already plundered the Commonwealth in the First and Second Partitions, saw the uprising as a threat to its newly acquired territories. Prussian forces, led by King Frederick William II himself, joined the campaign, creating a two-front war for Kosciuszko's forces. The uprising's military prospects began to deteriorate in the summer of 1794. Kosciuszko's forces were unable to secure a decisive victory against the combined Russian and Prussian armies. The Siege of Warsaw, a prolonged and brutal military confrontation, saw the Polish forces successfully hold off the invaders, but it was a Pyrrhic victory that drained the rebellion's limited resources. The Battle of Makiełowieś on October 10, 1794, was the turning point. Kosciuszko's army, attempting to prevent the junction of two Russian forces, was decisively defeated. Kosciuszko himself was wounded and captured in the battle, a catastrophic loss of command that effectively crippled the uprising. With Kosciuszko imprisoned, the leadership of the rebellion passed to Tomasz Wozecki. However, the loss of its central figure and strategic genius was an insurmountable blow. The final act of the uprising was the defense of Praga, a suburb of Warsaw. In November 1794, General Suvorov's forces launched a brutal assault on the city, which was defended by a mixed force of regular troops and civilian volunteers. The battle was a massacre. The Russian army, in a deliberate act of terror, systematically killed thousands of civilians, a devastating act that was intended to break the will of the resistance once and for all. The fall of Warsaw and the subsequent brutality of the Russian occupation brought the uprising to a definitive and tragic end. The Kosciuszko uprising, the final military resistance of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, had failed. It had been a heroic but ultimately futile struggle against a geopolitical reality that was too powerful to be overcome. The crushing of the rebellion provided the final justification for the partitioning powers to act on their ambitions. The Commonwealth, having proved its inability to govern itself, was now ripe for its final annihilation. The crushing of the Kosciuszko uprising in 1794 was the final, tragic act of military resistance for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. With the rebellion defeated, its leader imprisoned, and its capital, Warsaw, occupied by Russian troops, the Commonwealth was left utterly defenseless. This military defeat provided the partitioning powers Russia, Prussia, and Austria with the final and decisive justification to act on their long-held ambition of complete annihilation. The Commonwealth, having proved its inability to govern or defend itself, was now ripe for its final dismemberment. The Third Partition was a purely predatory act, a direct consequence of the political vacuum created by the uprising's failure. The three powers, having observed the rebellion with a mix of fear and opportunism, moved quickly to formalize their final annexations. This was not a matter of negotiation, but of mutual agreement among the three great powers. They decided to divide the last remaining territories of the Commonwealth, effectively erasing it from the map of Europe. The treaties for the Third Partition were signed in 1795 and 1797, and the Commonwealth's king, Stanisław August Poniatowski, was forced to abdicate. The territorial annexations were significant. Russia, as the dominant power, annexed a vast portion of the Commonwealth's eastern and southern territories, including Courland, Samogitia, and the remaining lands of Lithuania and Belarus. This territorial grab completed Russia's western expansion and consolidated its control over a massive, multi-ethnic population. Prussia, for its part, annexed a large portion of central Poland, including the capital city of Warsaw and the remaining territories of Mazovia and Podlakia. This strategic acquisition was a massive blow, as it gave Prussia control over the political and cultural heart of the nation. Austria, seeking to maintain its influence in the region, annexed the southern territories of Lesser Poland, including the city of Krakow, a major cultural and historical centre. With these final territorial annexations, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth ceased to exist as a sovereign state. Its name was formally erased from the maps of Europe, and its territory was divided among its three great neighbours. King Stanisław August Poniatowski, the last king of the Commonwealth and a man of the Enlightenment, was forced into exile in St. Petersburg, where he died a few years later. The Commonwealth's army was disbanded, its institutions were dismantled, and its government was dissolved. The Third Partition was not a compromise, but a full-scale act of political annihilation. The nation of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania would spend the next 123 years under foreign rule, awaiting a final chance at independence. The Third Partition of 1795, which formally erased the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth from the map of Europe, was not the end of the Polish and Lithuanian nations. Instead, it inaugurated a period of over a century of foreign rule, during which the memory and political identity of the former Commonwealth were preserved and transformed. The loss of a sovereign state, while a catastrophic political defeat, did not extinguish a national consciousness that had been forged over centuries of shared history, culture, and political tradition. This period of foreign domination became a crucible for a new kind of patriotism, one defined by the struggle for national survival. Following the partitions, the former territories of the Commonwealth were ruled by three distinct and often hostile powers: the Russian Empire, the Kingdom of Prussia, and the Habsburg Empire of Austria. Each partitioning power pursued a different policy towards its newly acquired Polish and Lithuanian subjects. Russia, which had annexed the largest portion of the former Commonwealth, pursued a policy of gradual Russification, seeking to integrate the Polish and Lithuanian nobilities into its own political and social structures. Prussia, with its focus on Germanization, attempted to suppress Polish culture and language in its annexed territories, particularly through a concerted effort to colonize the land with German settlers. Austria, while also pursuing Germanization, adopted a more lenient and tolerant approach, which allowed for the preservation of Polish language and culture in the region of Galicia. The political institutions of the former Commonwealth, including the Sejm, the army, and the legal system, were formally dismantled. The nobility, stripped of its political power, was forced to adapt to a new reality. Many nobles, dispossessed of their lands or unwilling to accept foreign rule, emigrated to other countries, particularly to France, where they formed a vibrant and influential diaspora known as the Great Emigration. This émigré community became the center of a political and intellectual movement dedicated to the cause of Polish independence. Others, particularly in the Russian partition, organized secret societies and conspiracies aimed at restoring the Commonwealth's sovereignty. The memory of the Commonwealth survived not through formal political institutions but through a vibrant and resilient cultural tradition. Polish language, literature, and history became a crucial means of national self-preservation. Poets, writers, and artists created a new national mythology, one that glorified the Commonwealth's past and romanticized the struggle for independence. The memory of the May 3rd Constitution, a symbol of national renewal, and the bravery of Tadeusz Kościuszko, a symbol of national resistance, became cornerstones of a new, romanticized vision of the nation. The ghost of the Commonwealth, therefore, remained a powerful force, inspiring a series of national uprisings in the 19th century and waiting for the opportune moment to once again re-emerge on the map of Europe. The final dismemberment of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1795 marked the end of a unique political experiment in European history. Yet, the ideals and institutions of the noble republic did not vanish with the state. Instead, they became a crucial part of the intellectual and political heritage that influenced European thought on constitutionalism, liberty, and republicanism for centuries to come. The Commonwealth's legacy was a complex and often contradictory one, offering both a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked liberty and a model for a non-absolutist form of government. The central pillar of the Commonwealth's legacy was its unique constitutional tradition. Unlike the absolutist monarchies that dominated Europe, the Commonwealth was a state where the power of the king was subordinate to the will of the nobility. The Nihil Novi Constitution and Henry's Articles, which enshrined the principle that the king could not enact new laws without the consent of the Sejm, were radical for their time. These legal acts served as a practical model for a constitutional government where a monarch's power was checked by a legislative body. The idea of a king ruling with the consent of the governed, a principle that underpinned the Commonwealth's political system, was a direct influence on the development of liberal constitutionalism in the 18th and 19th centuries. The concept of golden liberty, a cherished ideal of the Szlachta, also had a profound influence. While its abuse through the liberum veto ultimately contributed to the Commonwealth's downfall, the ideal itself, the commitment to individual freedoms, the right to resist a tyrannical monarch, and the belief in the political equality of all nobles resonated deeply with the republican movements of the Enlightenment. Figures like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his work Considerations on the Government of Poland, praised the Commonwealth for its commitment to civic virtue and its non-absolutist form of government. The Polish example became a touchstone for political thinkers who were critical of absolute monarchy and who sought alternative forms of governance. The memory of the May 3rd Constitution was particularly enduring. As the first modern constitution in Europe, it became a symbol of a nation's final, desperate struggle for self-preservation. Its reforms, the abolition of the liberum veto, the establishment of a hereditary monarchy, and the extension of rights to burghers were seen by patriots and reformers across Europe as a blueprint for a modern constitutional state. The Constitution's principles, though ultimately a failure in practice, became a powerful ideological weapon for Polish independence movements in the 19th century and a source of inspiration for constitutional reformers across the continent. The Commonwealth's legacy, therefore, was not one of political failure, but of a rich and complex tradition of liberty that would continue to inspire and shape European political thought long after the state itself had ceased to exist.